Today I am going to share two stories about people who found themselves in truly hopeless situations. In both of these stories, the main characters had to make a very unexpected decision that would completely change their lives forever. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that is all we do. We upload 2, 3, or even 4 times every single week. So, if that is of interest to you, please surprise the like button with a brand new wireless controller for their gaming console, but don't tell them it is really just their old controller that you cut the wire off of. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One night in late August of 1557, a Frenchman who was currently in his early 30s named Martin Gare was laying in a wooden bed in a makeshift military hospital in the town of St. Quentin, France, writhing around in intense pain. A few weeks earlier, Martin had fought in a massive bloody battle between the French and Spanish armies. It had been a truly horrible, violent, and chaotic battle. During the heavy fighting, Martin had been wounded very severely by flying shrapnel. In fact, his injury was so bad that he had lost his left leg. This injury was obviously devastating and incredibly painful, but Martin also knew he was just lucky to be alive. The military doctors who had treated him at one point had been absolutely certain that he was going to die. Martin and his doctors were all very surprised when he pulled through, survived the surgery, and slowly began to heal. But surviving was only the beginning of his struggle. Martin knew that a lot of his comrades who had already left St. Quentin by this point and moved on with the army or gone back to their homes very likely thought that he had died in the hospital. He was alive, but he was in a lot of physical pain, and he was completely devastated. He was incredibly lonely. All of his army mates had basically left the hospital and moved on with their lives, and he was still stuck here, unable to leave the bed. He was struggling to get used to the idea of life without the use of his leg. His whole world had come crashing down, and he was entirely by himself. All he had was the few army doctors who periodically came over to check on him. Beyond those people, he was isolated and trapped with his own awful, spiraling thoughts 24 hours a day. Eventually, these dark thoughts became the worst thing he had to deal with. They far surpassed the actual physical pain of his amputated leg. A deep, heavy depression had set in. As he lay there, Martin started thinking about his former life. He had grown up in a small rural village in southern France called Artiga. He had gotten married at a very young age to a local woman named Bertrande. They had loved each other very much, and they had a young son together named Sanxi. However, Martin had completely ruined his life when he made a terrible mistake. He stole some grain from his own father. In those days, stealing, especially from a family member, was not only a criminal act but also incredibly shameful. Martin had been so afraid of what the villagers would say and what his father would do that he decided not to face them at all. He simply left Artiga in the middle of the night, leaving behind his wife, his son, and his entire life. Initially, after he had run away, Martin had considered going back home to apologize and accept whatever punishment his family gave him. But he was always too scared to actually do it, so he just stayed away. Before long, he got caught up in the war, and years began to pass by. He was completely removed from the lives of Bertrand and his son. He was just gone, and now he had his leg blown off. In his depressed state, he could not stop thinking about his old life. He missed his wife terribly, but he kept telling himself that he was not the person she had married. He was a different man now, a degraded, disabled man with a wooden leg. He believed she would not even want to be with him at this point. He also thought about the rest of the village and how they would look at him as a thief who had abandoned his family. In his mind, he felt not just isolated in the hospital, but completely without a place in the world. As Martin lay in his hospital bed having these horrible thoughts and feeling the physical pain in his stump, he found his mind wandering to one of the few people who had been very important to him during his time in the army, his friend Arnaud. He wished more than anything that he had his friend here to talk to right now. Arnaud was a fellow soldier. Before the battle where Martin lost his leg, the two men had been great friends. They had bonded quickly because they had so much in common. They were both from small towns in the south of France, and they even looked very similar to one another. They looked so much alike that they could easily pass as brothers. Because of this close connection, they had spent many nights talking about their lives and sharing their deepest secrets with one another. But like everyone else in the military, Arnaud had moved on. He was no longer at the hospital, and Martin had no idea where the army had sent him. Martin's recovery took a very long time. He was stuck in a hospital bed with these horrible thoughts and awful pain for weeks, then months, and then years. Eventually, Martin was moved to a hospice care facility. Typically, hospice was a place where people were sent to die comfortably when there was no hope left. But Martin did not die. He actually continued to slowly get better. One afternoon in early September of 1560, which was about 3 years after he had lost his leg, Martin sat on a wooden bench outside of the hospice. He had been staying there ever since the war ended. The hospice was located just a few miles away from his hometown of Artiga. But despite being so close to his former life, to Martin, Artiga felt like it was a million miles away. He felt completely disconnected from his past. After Martin miraculously healed, he was outfitted with a crude wooden prosthetic leg. The doctors told him that he was finally free to leave and go about his life. But this news did not bring him much joy. He still had a lot of health problems, and his long, lonely recovery had completely convinced him that he was just a shell of the man he used to be. He was certain that nobody from his previous life would ever want him back. Not his wife, not his son, and not his neighbors. He had resigned himself to simply wasting away and dying all alone in some quiet place. He figured that was his destiny, and he was not going to try to change it. But as Martin sat on the bench that afternoon, he suddenly heard a voice calling out. He looked over at the dusty road in front of the hospice and saw a man he had never met before walking quickly toward him. As the stranger approached the bench, he looked closely at Martin and asked if his name was Martin Garr. When Martin slowly nodded his head and said that yes, that was his name, the stranger's face immediately lit up with excitement. He explained that he had been looking all over the region for him. The man said he had been sent on behalf of Martin's family back in Artiga, and that he wanted to bring Martin back home to them. Martin could not believe his ears. He was so thoroughly convinced that he was destined for a life of shame and isolation, and now here was a stranger telling him that his family wanted him back. They were actively looking for him. It was completely unbelievable. He had assumed he would never see his home again, and now he was being told to come along and go home. But before Martin could ask any of the questions that were racing through his mind, the stranger told him that they could not go straight to Artiga. First, they had to make a stop at the courthouse in the nearby city of Toulouse. Martin was confused and asked what he meant by that. The stranger explained the reason behind the trip to the courthouse, and when Martin heard the details, he was absolutely stunned. He simply could not believe what he was being told. A few days later, on the morning of September 12th, Martin climbed out of a wooden wagon in front of the massive courthouse in Toulouse, which was about 40 miles away from his hometown. Martin felt butterflies in his stomach, and his heart was racing as he used his cane to slowly climb the stone steps toward the front doors. He took a deep breath, threw open the double doors, and stepped inside. The instant he walked through the doors, he was greeted by a massive crowd of people filling the courtroom. The room fell completely silent as everyone turned to look at him. People began to whisper in hushed voices, expressing absolute shock. That was when Martin realized he had walked directly into the middle of a major trial. Martin stood there for a moment, staring back at all the people who were staring at him. He realized that he recognized many of the faces in the crowd. He saw some of his old childhood friends. He saw his uncle Pierre, and he saw his sisters. He also saw his wife Bertrande, and sitting right next to her was a young boy who had to be his son Sanxi. All of these people were looking at Martin with expressions of absolute shock and disbelief. They were staring at his face, and then they were looking down at his wooden leg. It was like they were looking at a ghost before Martin could fully process the overwhelming emotion of seeing his family after more than a decade. He looked toward the front of the courtroom. As soon as his eyes landed on the man standing before the judges, he knew that everything the stranger on the bench had told him was absolutely true. Martin had to bite his lip to keep from screaming out in anger. It turned out that Martin had been completely wrong to believe his family and the town of Artiga would never accept him back. They actually had welcomed him back with open arms years ago, or at least they thought they did. Because when Martin looked at the front of the courtroom, he saw his old army buddy Arno. And Arno was currently on trial for fraud. Arno did not just look like he could be Martin's brother. He looked exactly like Martin. Arno had been very disliked in his own hometown because of his reputation as a shifty con artist. He had wanted a fresh start in a new place after he left the army. Years earlier, while Martin was lying in that military hospital, so badly injured that the doctors thought he would die, his best friend Arno was using their physical likeness and his knowledge of Martin's life to steal his identity. Arno had simply walked into Artiga and announced that he was Martin Garr. The entire town not only believed him, but they also celebrated his return. Arno was so incredibly convincing that even Bertrande believed he was her husband. She had welcomed him into her home and her bed, and she had gone on to have 2 additional children with him, fully believing that this man was Martin. However, Martin's uncle Pierre had never bought the story. He thought the returned man was an impostor, and he eventually took him to court for fraud. That trial was the reason the stranger had tracked Martin down at the hospice and brought him to Toulouse. They needed the real Martin to prove that Arno was a fake. And of course, the moment Martin stepped into that courtroom, it worked. When his family laid eyes on the real Martin Garr with his wooden leg, they realized right away that Arno was a complete fraud. Arno was ultimately found guilty, sentenced to death, and hanged on a gallows set up right in front of Martin's house in Artiga while the entire village watched. As for Bertrande, she was horrified to learn she had been living with a stranger. She begged Martin to forgive her, but he never did. Now we are going to transition to our second story, which takes place nearly 400 years later in a completely different and incredibly harsh environment. This story takes place in the frozen, silent, and unforgiving wilderness of Alaska in November of 1940. One cold morning, an 84-year-old prospector named Erwin Robertson was hiking down a snowy ridge in the middle of the Alaskan wild. He was pushing a heavy wooden sled that was loaded with all of his supplies and animal furs. Pushing this sled was incredibly hard work. As Erwin struggled to move the heavy load through the deep snow, he was breathing very heavily. Even though the air was freezing cold, he could feel himself sweating heavily underneath his thick winter clothes. He knew he was going to be completely covered in sweat. Erwin knew that what he was doing was extremely risky. After all, he was 84 years old, and he was certainly not as young and strong as he used to be. You do not want to get hurt or completely exhaust yourself out in the wilderness, because help is far away. But Erwin was not about to slow down because he was incredibly eager to get home. Erwin had first come to this rugged area about 40 years earlier as part of the Great Alaskan Gold Rush. Like almost every other prospector, he spent every summer and fall living in a small cabin up in the mountains, where he spent his days hunting and mining for gold. But his real home, the place where he lived during the long, cold winter and spring, was the pioneer town of Eagle, Alaska. That was exactly where Erwin was headed on this freezing morning. He had just wrapped up a very successful fall season up in the mountains, and he had originally intended on staying in his mountain cabin a bit longer. But a few days ago, the temperature had suddenly dropped, and Erwin realized he did not have enough supplies to wait out a major winter storm in that isolated cabin. So, he had packed up his things, told the handful of other prospectors in the area where he was going, and set out for Eagle. This was a grueling 100-mile trek through very rough, snowy terrain. But Erwin had made this trip at least once a year for the past 4 decades, so he knew the route very well. Despite the intense physical exertion of pushing the heavy sled, he kept up as hard of a pace as he could manage for the next couple of hours. Around midday, he finally allowed himself to slow down and take a quick break. He stopped, reached into his parka, and pulled out his canteen to take a sip of water. As he was drinking, something caught his attention out of the corner of his eye. Even though he only saw a quick flash of movement in the trees, he knew immediately what it was. During his trek, a pack of wild wolves had been following him. He had known they were back there, but as a man who had lived in the Alaskan wild for 40 years, he was not unaccustomed to running into wolves. He knew they were dangerous, especially for an old man alone in the woods, but he was not overly concerned. He figured he would keep moving. He capped his canteen, put it back in his parka, and continued on his way. A few hours later, Erwin was much further down the ridge, but he was starting to get extremely cold. In fact, ice had begun to form on his beard and eyelashes. The temperature had dropped much faster than he had expected, and he was starting to get worried. He knew the cold would get much worse once the sun went down. Because he had been pushing the heavy sled, he had been sweating heavily under his clothes, meaning he was now damp and wet close to his skin. This was extremely dangerous in these temperatures. He decided that it was in his best interest to stop, build a fire, and make sure he was warm before continuing. He kept his eyes peeled for a good spot to camp as he pushed the sled along. But then, he heard a sound that caused him to stop. It was not the sound of the wolves. It was the sound of trickling water. In the freezing wilderness, running water could be incredibly dangerous. Getting wet in these sub-zero temperatures practically guaranteed that you would freeze to death. Erwin moved very cautiously toward the sound, wanting to make sure he did not accidentally step into a hidden creek. He rounded a bend and saw the source of the noise. It was a creek that had almost completely frozen over, except for a small gap where water was trickling out and spilling over the ice. Over time, this water had frozen in thin, moundy layers on top of the creek. Erwin realized that as long as he was careful to avoid stepping on the frozen creek itself, this would make an excellent camp. He could refill his canteen, and there were plenty of dead trees nearby for firewood. By this point, Erwin was so cold that he was shivering violently. He parked his sled and began gathering firewood. As he was doing this, he spotted several of the wolves. They had not stopped following him. They were lingering in the trees nearby, clearly watching his movements. For the first time, Erwin started to feel a real sense of anxiety about them. They were much closer than before, suggesting they were getting braver. But Erwin knew he could not keep walking. He was physically exhausted, his clothes were damp with sweat, and he was freezing. He had to start a fire to warm up, or he would die of hypothermia. About 20 minutes later, he had gathered enough wood and piled it next to his sled. To light his fire, Erwin had to take off his thick mittens, exposing his bare hands to the freezing cold. He used his teeth to pull off his first mitten. He reached into his parka and pulled out his fire-starting kit, which contained thin scraps of dry tinder. He grabbed a match and struck it against the box, but it did not light. He tried again, but the head of the match simply crumbled. Erwin did not panic yet. He knew that in extreme cold, matches could be unreliable. He used his teeth to pull off his other mitten so he would have better dexterity. He took out a second match and struck it. This one caught fire, but his hands were shaking so violently from the cold that before he could transfer the flame to the tinder, the shaking motion put the flame out. At this point, Erwin did start to panic. The pain in his bare hands was intense, and his fingers were starting to seize up and grow stiff from the cold. He was afraid that even if he put his mittens back on, his hands would not warm up fast enough. He needed the fire to warm his hands, but he needed his hands to start the fire. He gritted his teeth and used his stiff fingers to fumble for a third match. It took all of his focus just to keep from dropping it. He managed to strike it against the matchbook, and to his immense relief, it caught fire. He carefully sheltered the small flame and brought it over to the tinder. He held the flame against the dry grass, waiting for it to catch, but nothing happened. The flame simply sputtered and went out. Erwin stared at the tinder in utter confusion and horror. He had lit the match, he had held it to the wood, but it had not caught fire. He reached down and touched the tinder with his numb fingers, and his heart instantly sank. The tinder was wet. He realized that while he had been pushing the heavy sled and sweating, the moisture from his body had seeped through his clothes and into his inner pocket, soaking his fire-starting kit. The situation was catastrophic. Without any dry tinder, he could not start a fire. Without a fire, he was going to freeze to death. He could hear the wolves howling nearby, moving closer in the darkness. He knew he was doomed, and he had to make a choice about how he wanted to die. He did not want to be eaten alive by wolves. A week later, several of the people living in Eagle noticed Erwin had not arrived. They grew very concerned and contacted the local U.S. Marshal's office. On November 19th, a deputy and his search team were out in the wilderness looking for the old prospector. They emerged into a clearing and spotted Erwin's sled set up on the bank of the frozen creek. They rushed down and looked around. They found his rifle propped against a tree, his stack of unused firewood, and his matches scattered on the ground. But Erwin was not there. The deputy noticed a large number of wolf tracks surrounding the sled. He told his men that Erwin had likely been killed and carried off by wolves and ordered them to follow the tracks to recover his body. But as they followed the tracks, they realized something was wrong. There was no blood anywhere on the snow. If a struggle had occurred, there would have been signs of violence, but the snow was completely clean. The deputy ordered his men to return to the sled to search more closely. They eventually spotted a set of human footprints. They followed them, thinking Erwin might have wandered off in a state of confusion. But the footprints only led a few feet away from the sled before doubling back and stopping right at the edge of the frozen creek. The deputy looked out toward the center of the frozen creek, focusing on a strange, smooth mound of ice that he had not noticed before. Suddenly, the deputy understood what had happened to Erwin Robertson. A week earlier, as the old prospector realized he could not start a fire and that the wolves were closing in, he had made a final desperate decision. He walked out to the middle of the frozen creek, right where the cold water was trickling out of the ice, and he laid down on his back. The freezing water continued to spill out onto his body, rapidly freezing in solid layers over him in the sub-zero air. Over the course of the night, the water had built up a thick cocoon of ice over his entire body, freezing him to death but protecting him from the wolves. The deputy walked out onto the ice, cleared away the snow, and saw Erwin's body perfectly preserved inside the solid block of ice, safe from the predators. When the real Martin Garr finally returned to his house in Artiga, the initial celebration quickly faded into a very quiet and tense reality. The villagers who had spent 3 years laughing, drinking, and working alongside Arno were suddenly forced to look at the real Martin, who was a much more difficult and stern man. Martin was not the friendly, generous neighbor that Arno had pretended to be. He was a bitter man who had spent years in a lonely military hospital, and he had lost his leg in a brutal war. He did not have Arno's smooth social skills or easy humor. The people of the village realized that while they had their old neighbor back in name, the man they had actually grown to like was gone forever. Martin's sisters felt a deep sense of guilt for being so easily fooled by an impostor, and they struggled to build a relationship with their brother who seemed to resent them for welcoming a stranger into their family. The household became a very dark and silent place, filled with unexpressed regret and tension. For Bertrand, the return of her true husband was an absolute nightmare. She had spent years mourning Martin, only to have a man arrive who claimed to be him, treated her with kindness, and restored her position in the village. Arno had been a good husband to her, far better than the real Martin had ever been before he ran away. They had built a comfortable life together, and she had given birth to 2 daughters whom she loved dearly. Suddenly, she was told that this man was a liar and a criminal, and she watched him get dragged away to the gallows. She was forced to return to the real Martin, a husband who openly despised her and accused her of being unfaithful. Martin refused to look at his new stepdaughters, seeing them only as the offspring of a criminal who had stolen his life. Bertrand was trapped in a marriage with a man who would never forgive her, living in a house where her every action was watched with suspicion. She had to live with the knowledge that she had loved an impostor, and that her mistake had cost that man his life. The legal trial of Arno was one of the most famous cases in French history, and the documents from the court in Toulouse are still studied by historians today. Arno was an incredibly intelligent man who had almost succeeded in pulling off the ultimate deception. During the trial, he had displayed an unbelievable memory, recalling details about Martin's childhood, his neighbors, and his wedding that even the judges found impossible to dispute. If the real Martin had not walked into the courtroom at that exact moment, Arno would have been acquitted and allowed to keep Martin's life. His execution was a massive public spectacle. He was hanged directly in front of the Gar family home as a warning to anyone who would attempt to steal another person's identity. Before he died, Arno finally confessed to his crimes, expressing regret for his deception but also thanking Bertrand for the years of happiness they had shared. His death left a permanent scar on the village of Artuga. To understand the depth of Erwin Robertson's decision, we have to look back at the 40 years he spent in the Alaskan wilderness. Erwin had arrived in the north during the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898, a time when thousands of men traveled to the frozen territory in search of fortune. Most of those men either died, went broke, or returned home empty-handed. But Erwin was different. He fell in love with the silent beauty and the extreme challenges of the landscape. He learned how to read the weather, how to track animals, and how to survive in temperatures that would kill an inexperienced person in minutes. He built his mountain cabin with his own hands, and he took pride in his ability to live completely off the grid. For 40 years, the wilderness had been his partner, and he respected its power. When he realized that he could not start his fire, he did not curse the land or beg for mercy. He accepted that his time had come, and he chose to let the cold take him on his own terms. The physiological process of freezing to death is often described by survivors of severe hypothermia as a strangely peaceful way to die, compared to other forms of trauma. In the initial stages of extreme cold, the body fights violently to generate heat, causing intense shivering and severe pain in the fingers and toes. But as the core temperature continues to drop, the brain begins to slow down and the nervous system grows numb. Eventually, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, or a feeling of intense warmth, can occur, where the person feels hot even though they are freezing. Finally, a deep, heavy sleepiness sets in, and the individual drifts off into unconsciousness without feeling any pain. Erwin Robertson, as an experienced woodsman, would have known this. He knew that lying in the trickling water of the creek would cause his body to freeze rapidly, bringing a swift into his suffering and preventing the wolves from tearing him apart while he was still alive. When the deputy and his search party finally returned to the town of Eagle with Erwin's body, the news sent a wave of quiet sorrow through the small community. The pioneers of Eagle were a tight-knit group of people who had all faced the dangers of the Alaskan winter, and they had a deep respect for Erwin. They gathered to carve a grave out of the frozen ground, a difficult task that required building fires to soften the earth. They buried Erwin in the local cemetery under a simple wooden marker. The story of his final decision of how he had frozen himself into the ice to keep the wolves away quickly became a legend among the trappers and prospectors of the Yukon Territory. They spoke of him with a mixture of sadness and awe, recognizing that the old man had maintained his independence and his dignity right up to his very last breath. He had lived as a free man of the wild, and he had died on his own terms. These two extraordinary accounts show us the unpredictable paths of human lives. One moment you are running from a small mistake, and the next you are watching your double hang. One moment you are pushing a sled full of gold, and the next you are choosing to let the freezing water of a creek become your tomb. We like to think we have control over our lives, but these cases show us that we are often at the mercy of sudden, overwhelming circumstances. It is in those moments of absolute crisis that our true character is revealed, and the choices we make define us forever. Both Martin Gar and Erwin Robertson faced the end of their worlds, and both chose to go out on their own terms. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.